First guest out today is Mr. Stephen Cotton, who is General Secretary of the ITF. ITF represents transport unions around the world. He's a former maritime coordinator. He's been working 25 years for the ITF. And he's going to tell us a bit about the FOC campaign, the Flag of Convenience campaign, and about the ITF policy. And we know that you're a very busy man, Stephen, so we really appreciate that you could come here to Norway. So please welcome Mr. Stephen Cotton.
Good afternoon. How are you? All ready? Okay, so first of all, it's a tremendous initiative to have this boat here in this very important week. And it's a privilege for me to accept the invitation. This is a very important session for developed world seafarers, Norwegian seafarers, and developing world seafarers. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview about what is the ITF, and then we're going to speak about our breakthrough report on cabotage. And I'm determined that we can get a bit of a conversation going at the end where you can ask us all the difficult questions you wanted to ask about the ITF that we've built up. And I know there's a number of ship owners in the room who will want to challenge us on a number of the issues. So let me move on. I think we have to say the ITF isn't a new boy on the block. We've been around a long time. We were started by industrial action, unsurprisingly, when seafarers, British seafarers in the port of Rotterdam went on strike, and the British Ship Owners Association at that time tried to bring strike breakers onto the ship, and the Dutch dockers refused to allow them onto the ship. So we started from a conflicted period, but we also believe very much in dialogue and how to move forward. But we're a very long and traditional organisation. So just wanted to give you an overview about what we've been doing over those 120 odd years. Again, originally a maritime organisation only, but we moved and developed road, rail, the Flag of Convenience campaign, which I'm going to touch on a little bit, which I think many of you are familiar with. We have some previous ITF inspectors in the room, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. We have inspectors from 1971, and their job is to visit the ships and make sure the agreements signed by ship owners are fully implemented. Of course, we really believe in equality, so we've been developing our work with women. We had a 50th anniversary, and we ran a ship called the Global Mariner, which was an exhibition ship. POC, Ports of Convenience campaign. I know that that's a big issue here, particularly in Oslo at the moment. We've created a bargaining forum, the International Bargaining Forum, where we've had many different companies represented, and we represent all of the seafarers, developing world and developed. Mexico City policy, which is our Bible about what we respect, what we expect, and what we need to deliver. And of course, Maritime Labour Convention, where we work very closely with the ICS, the International Chamber of Shipping, to develop a safety net for the world's seafarers. As you can see, we're pretty blunt about our campaigning about the Flag of Convenience campaign, and many of you know that we fight Flag of Convenience because of the deregulated nature. But on the other hand, we have many good relationships with many employers who honour and respect and bargain faithfully. So some of you will know that I was appointed General Secretary in 2014, and we've been looking at new ways to help the strength of unions globally, and we describe those as the 4 levers. So tactically, our job is to build membership inside national unions and support them in their projects and initiatives. And part of the way of doing that is recognising that, particularly in transport, everything is either a hub or a corridor for providing, whether it's passengers, freight, train, rail, aviation, the whole package. So we spend a lot of time trying to identify how we can build cooperation with unions and relationship with employers. In the maritime, we have a long history, as you saw, and so we have very good relationships, long-term relationships, with all of the shipping companies, the oil majors, the major container companies. And we're looking to build on that relationship outside of the maritime sector. And we're tackling that through aviation. We ran a campaign about DHL, where we tried to enforce global standards. We signed an agreement with the head office, and we're beginning to move some of the maritime principles into the other sections of the ITF. One of the issues we wanted to recognise, so the ITF traditionally was a European organisation, and then the Americans, but in order for us to be a truly global organisation, we have to recognise there is significant change in the world at large. And we see movements and unions, different kinds of unions in different parts of the world, but our job is to make sure that we have strong unions in all parts of the world. And we're looking at, particularly at the moment, Asia and Pacific, because we see there's a lot of opportunities there, particularly out of the maritime section in rail, aviation, to build strength. One of the objectives is activating mass membership. So that's one of the targets I set myself and the team, Jackie's being here for our maritime coordinator, is to build our membership. And that means we have to be more valuable to the national unions. So like you, we have to be providing a service. Now, we have 675 unions affiliated in over 146 countries. We have a little bit of complication on what is our real membership, because unions are like everybody else. Some of our unions are from developing world. They can't declare and pay us for every member. So we have paid up membership for over 5 million. But the unions that are affiliated to the ITF, we believe conservatively represent 19, nearly 20 million transport workers. So we have a sizable family to look after. In maritime, as you know, most of you are experts on this, there's a balance between ship-owning nations and what we describe as labour supply countries. The ITF, over many, many years, has been able to forge very strong relationships. The unions at the forefront of that were our colleagues in this particular country, who have a very long maritime history, and they were one of the first in the 70s to build cooperation. Somehow, we have been able to build trust and respect in the Philippines, in India, in Russia, and there's an understanding between our affiliates how to cooperate to make sure that we represent their best interests when it comes to managing relationships with employers. So the Mexico City policy, which is published and available for everyone, is our guideline about what we should do, and that covers many, many areas, and I want to a little bit focus on this area. So the reason we're here today is to talk about cabotage and why it's important for shipping and why it's important for nations to have a maritime culture. So all of the ITF policies covered in the Mexico City policy are very pertinent to the situation today in Norway. So first, Seafarers Charter, that identifies what we commit to the seafarers that are our members. Honesty, transparency, professionalism. National flag, of course, our FOC campaign is built on the premise that national flag is best. We have national unions, we have national regulation and national power. And here, more than anywhere else, that applies. But you're also big players in the cruise industry. And so we've also had to come up with new policies and effective strategies to deal with the maritime crew, of course, and we include in that the hotel staff, which is a slightly different challenge, and we've got very good coverage in the cruise ship sector. Athens policy, and I know there's constant challenges for colour line and those issues. We have a policy that says the best terms and conditions of the two countries where the ship operates must be applied. So for colour line, that would be Germany and Norway, or Norway and Denmark. And there's a conversation between our family to make sure we can enforce those terms and conditions. Bilateral arrangements. This union, all three of our maritime unions in Norway have been leading the relationship with building power with the Filipinos, the Indians, the Russians, the Croatians, and that's built on mutual respect and a cooperation and a space around the table. And we want to deliver more of those principles throughout the ITF family. And of course, a very difficult time for offshore, and we respect that. But the situation, and particularly our conversation about cabotage, has to be national terms and conditions to ensure a sustainable industry for Norwegians. And I will just tell you a quick story about, yesterday I had the privilege to ride on a motor cruiser with a seafarer member of the Norwegian Seafarers Union, and he was the second generation, And on this ship is his son, who's being trained to be the third generation. And on this conversation about what does cabotage mean, this nation is proud to be a seafaring nation. And when you meet people like I did yesterday, 3 generations of seafarers, you mustn't lose that. It's incredibly important that this country remains a seafarers nation. And you need a sustainable industry. You need to bring young blood into cabotage. And we can talk about, when we take some questions, examples about where that works and why it can work. So ITF inspectors, I would normally ask them to stand up, but you can't see them. We're proud to say that my old comrade, who you'll be hearing from later, Jim Given, was an ITF inspector once. Now he's the president of his union, and his vice president used to be an ITF inspector. It's very important that we have good people out there helping seafarers, but also understanding that, you know, shipping isn't an easy industry, and that there are good ship owners who sign agreements and respect them, but there are also bad ship owners. And there's a lot of information here, and I will allow you to, we'll share the presentation if anyone wants it. But these are our statistics for the FOC campaign, and we need to be influencing that change. We're also looking at the FOC campaign under Jackie's terrific leadership. So thank you, Norway, for giving her to us. It's much appreciated. And in conclusion, we're looking at the future of technology and the issue of Asia Pacific, how we build strength. I'm going to give the mic over. I've probably gone a little bit longer than I planned, but please take the opportunity to ask questions at the end on anything I have or haven't covered. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. I would also like to welcome Jacqueline Smith. Even though you're not giving a presentation, we're very glad that you're here. You're Stephen's successor as the maritime coordinator, and you were also the former president of the Norwegian Seafarers Union, so we're glad that you are also here. Within the ITF family, we have the next speaker is Deirdre Fitzpatrick. She's a lawyer and she's the director of Seafarers Rights International. That's a legal research center for issues concerning seafarers' rights. And you're here to present a report that you're producing now about maritime cabotage regulations around the world. And we are particularly interested to listen to that because it's been claimed that it would be an extraordinary measure for Norway to put in place cabotage regulations. So you have the floor now, Deirdre.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try speaking from this mic. I'm told there's a little bit of feedback, so if you have any problems hearing me, please just let me know. First, I just want to say that I'm very pleased to be here today, and thank you very much for the invitation. I have to start with an apology that I don't speak Norwegian. I apologize for that. I speak English with an Irish accent, probably because I'm from Ireland, but I hope that we can understand each other well. Thank you very much, Tadia, for the introduction. I want just to tell you a little bit about my organization. So it's a legal research center, Seafarers Rights International. We are based in London. And we carry out legal research projects for third parties. We're an independent organization, and our work is overseen by an advisory board. Our advisory board consists of judges, professors, and members of the maritime industry, ship owners, ship managers, unions, and welfare agencies. So in all our work, we try to take into account all the different interests across the maritime industry, and above all, we are very rigorous that our work is independent and verified. Last year, the ITF approached us and asked us to carry out a worldwide survey of the laws concerning maritime cabotage. And whilst that sounded quite daunting, it seemed like a good way to spend a few months. In fact, it took a lot longer than a few months. But we embarked on the project, And the project was to survey countries to find out which countries regulate their maritime cabotage trades, and specifically which countries have restrictions on protections in their maritime cabotage trade. So today, I wanted to give you some information about the results that we have from that survey. Let me see if I can get this to work. All right. Obviously, when we started our research, we looked to see what previous work already existed in this area. And without doubt, there have been some surveys previously done. We found 3 previous surveys. The first one dated right back to 1931, and it was carried out by the League of Nations. And quickly, I'll just inform you that they found 29 countries. They reviewed 29 countries that had reserved cabotage to national or to regional flag vessels. Then in 1991, the US Maritime Administration carried out a survey where they identified 47 countries that had restrictions against foreign traffic in their US waters. Then in 2010, the ITF, together with its Australian Union, studied 35 countries. All of those countries have restrictions in their maritime cabotage laws. Now, all of these were excellent studies, but they were all out of date. And hence the request by the ITF for us to carry out a survey that would build on this information, update this information, and if possible, expand on this information. So we started our survey, and we started with every country that is a member of the United Nations. That was 193 countries. From that, we excluded countries that are landlocked or with only one port. We reckoned they couldn't have much maritime cabotage restrictions. So we took those out of our survey. That was 57 countries excluded. That left 136 countries in our survey. So in terms of our methodology for carrying out our research, we relied on local lawyers. We contacted local lawyers in 136 countries around the world. We sent them a survey and a questionnaire on their maritime cabotage laws. We identified their laws, and we identified any protections or restrictions that were contained in their maritime cabotage laws. We then looked at other third-party reports. We looked at reports produced by the World Trade Organization, reports produced by the European Union, and reports produced by UNCTAD. We took all that information, we debated it with the local lawyers, and we categorized all the countries as to whether or not they had restrictions in their national laws. The results, these were the results of our survey. Of the 136 countries that have maritime cabotage laws, or that could have maritime cabotage laws, 91 countries have restrictions and protections in their laws. 45 countries didn't. That is 67% of countries around the world have some form of restrictions and protections in their maritime laws to protect their maritime cabotage trade. Now, this we thought was a significant finding. We had no expectations before it, but these were the results of all the analysis and the debate that we had with the 136 sets of lawyers around the world. Now, in order to expand on that finding, one of the questions that we had asked the lawyers was to identify national policies as they related to cabotage. And perhaps unsurprisingly, not many countries have neat policies actually drawn up. So we received some national policies in writing, but what we did instead, in the absence of that, was to look at the laws themselves. Now, of course, it's quite obvious that countries write laws for the benefit of the national interests. Why else would they have those laws? So it's possible to look at the laws and to work backwards and to read from those laws what were the actual purposes and the reasons why those countries had chosen to have protections and restrictions in their laws. So these are some of the reasons that we found. I've just given you a list of some of the reasons that were actually contained in the laws. So the first one that was quite obvious in many of the laws was fair competition. Some of the laws actually state that their purpose is to promote fair competition and to prevent illegitimate competition, using their own words from the laws. Other laws, the focus of the laws was skills. They wanted to retain skills in the local workforce, and they wanted to promote the transfer of maritime knowledge amongst the local workers. A third reason for having the laws, which was contained in the laws, was to promote jobs for local seafarers. Many national regimes provided for a percentage of employment for some nationals within their laws. A fourth reason that appeared within the laws was to promote the domestic transport companies. Some of the laws were aimed to increase the number of ships on the national registers, or to promote ship ownership, or to promote shipbuilding, or to promote ship supply, generally to promote the industry within the country. Another reason that we commonly saw in the laws that were drafted is safety. Many of the laws referred to the need to ensure safety in their waters, the seaworthiness of the ships who were transporting the goods in their cabotage trade. Linked to that, then, some of the laws referred to the need to protect the environment. It was a common theme that national laws, where they could control or make statements about who were trading in their national waters, would give greater control over the need and the requirement to protect the environment, which of course is an obligation under international law anyway. Some of the laws made reference to national security. There was a desire within the policy of the countries to know exactly the identity of the countries trading along their national routes within the cabotage trade. And the final example, which appeared in a number of the laws, was a reference to public service. Cabotage is sometimes seen as providing a public service. And that was another reason why some of the countries chose to have restrictions and protections within their cabotage. So this is I would say, just a list of reasons, which you find different multiples of these reasons in different national legislation, because of course every country has its own geography, every country has its own pressures, its own priorities, but these were the common themes that were appearing in every country that had chosen to have maritime cabotage laws and to restrict their trade in the maritime cabotage trade. So I just wanted to make a few miscellaneous comments now that came out of the research that we were doing. First of all, when we talk about maritime cabotage, it's easy to think you're talking about one thing, but of course there are many different definitions of maritime cabotage around the world. And specifically, for example, we came across about 3 different definitions which relate to geographical maritime cabotage. So some countries, for example, regulated the trade which was between ports, just on the mainland, from port to port. Other countries regulated the cabotage trade from the ports along the coast out to the 12-mile territorial zone. So they regulated the trade within that particular area. And other laws then regulated maritime cabotage from the coast right out, the 200 miles out into the EEZ zone. So all these different approaches were taken, and each of them was tailored to the need of the particular country as to what sort of definition they wanted for cabotage in the first instance. Another issue, of course, which we came across, our research focused on maritime laws, but there are also other sorts of laws which can impact on how the maritime cabotage trade operates in those countries. So you see, for example, tax laws, immigration laws, employment laws, all fitting within the maritime cabotage shipping laws. So it's a matrix which each country sort of builds up in order to serve their particular needs. Another issue, of course, we came across are regional trade agreements. Stephen mentioned the mega regional trade agreements, which are now the subject of much discussion. Much more common are bilateral trade agreements and regional trade agreements. You're familiar, for example, some of these work like in Europe, the EFTA agreement, which dispenses with national cabotage but promotes regional cabotage. And other regions of the world have also chosen to promote cabotage within their region against foreign ships from their region. So this is also a common issue which is debated within the cabotage debate. And then finally, to our surprise also, as we were doing the research, whilst there were a number of countries who said they did not have cabotage, there are also a number of countries that are currently debating the introduction of cabotage. Probably the biggest example we saw there were the group of African countries who are fulfilling a policy statement, the African Charter Agreement, to promote cabotage within the African zone. So it may be that even the figures that I've given you will increase if cabotage is becoming recognized in even more countries. So really, in conclusion, what I wanted to say is that historically, maritime cabotage protections have been widespread. We discovered laws that dated from the 16th century. It's a very common feature across the law, and it's been developed since the 16th century. And our survey shows that it remains in a majority of countries that cabotage protections and restrictions are for the national benefit. Almost 67% of countries with 2 or more ports have some form of protections. Now, without doubt, this subject is a sensitive political subject. There are political, economic, and social priorities at play here when a country decides what its policies and approach should be to its trade along its cabotage routes. But I think the fact that the majority of countries have found good reasons to have protections in their maritime cabotage trade is a worthwhile issue to be aware of, and I hope it will be useful in your considerations and debates as you go forward in this subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. Our next speaker is the president of the Norwegian Confederations of Trade Union, Mr. Hans Christian Gabrielsen, and he will now comment on the report and on the struggle that the Norwegian maritime unions have had to introduce Norwegian employment conditions in Norwegian waters.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Obviously, I'm not a seafarer, as you can see. I think I've had some trouble. Oops. Better? Okay. Good afternoon. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to give some brief comments on the report. Quite a breakthrough, I would put it. But let me start with putting that Norway is a seafaring nation, and we have a long tradition in Norway for working at sea. And working at sea is a subject of hard competition. And here, as in an increasing number of years, Norwegian wages and working conditions are under pressure. Many employers are tempted, or should I say pressured, to use labor at pay levels that won't even be close to paying for covering the living costs in Norway. On land, we call this social dumping. And social dumping is an ever-growing threat to the organized working life, which is an very, very important pillar of the Norwegian model, and which is a model that we hold very high. So LO has always worked towards employers and authorities to prevent social dumping. Obviously, this must also be the case when it comes to the maritime industry and the maritime transport. Let me put it this way. If the job primarily takes place within our waters and on our continental shelf, wages and working conditions must be on a Norwegian level. I think that our seafarers should be able to take for granted that they can work in these areas and also support living in Norway. Norway is good at conversion. We adapt new technology and new ways of doing things very quickly. There are hundreds of seminars taking place this week on this issue. But we also know that if Norwegian seamen lose their job to foreign labor, Norway also lose their seafaring skills. And this doesn't benefit the shipping industry, nor the yards, or the equipment industry. And the experience-based expertise gained through the use of vessels and equipment is an important part of our innovative ability. So if we lose the struggle for workplaces at sea in our seas, we will create less values, and the communities along the coast will also become more vulnerable. And I will put it like this. A Norway without seamen is a poorer and lesser Norway. So the fight against social dumping is a long-term work, and a work that requires close cooperation with politicians, authorities, and employers. And I think the survey that the ITF has conducted and that Deirdre presented, I think that's a breakthrough. It shows first and foremost that it's perfectly common practice to regulate maritime activity in most coastal waters. The regulations are certainly different from country to country, and they are developed and adapt to the needs of each country. They are developed and adapt to the claim that we will face countermeasures from other countries if Norway makes its own regulations does not hold. I found reading from this report. And I don't think this is not protectionism as claimed by those who oppose regulations. These are equal terms of competitions for seafarers. And I'm very pleased that our parliament now, Stortinget, unanimously instructed the government to investigate the possibility of demanding Norwegian pay and working conditions in Norwegian waters and on the Norwegian continental shelf. This decision came late, very, very late, but better late than never. And the Parliament supports our demands for proper pay and working conditions. And this provides important new knowledge that must be affected, that must affect the work that the Parliament has ordered the government to do. And I also expect that the investigation should be conducted out of the respect for the tripartite cooperation system, which we have long traditions for in Norway. And this requires a public appointed committee where all the parties are represented. And since the matter is affecting the organizations of the future labor market in our maritime areas, it must also be handled by the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. And it should also be the commissioner for this investigation. Thank you very much. I look forward to the debate, and thank you so very much for the job that the ITF has done. Thank you very much.
Yes, you can remain here, and we will now welcome to a short debate those who made presentations on Christian and Stephen, Deirdre, and we also have from Canada James Given and Johnny Hansen, the president of the Norwegian Seafarers Union. So if you can all come up here.
Find a place?
Yeah, get a place, and then I will shoot some questions, and then at the end we can have a couple of questions from the floor as well. First, James Given, you have traveled a long way from Canada. You are not only the president of the Seafarers Union International of Canada, but you're also chair of the ITF Cabotage Task Force. And that was a task force that was established by the ITF 2 years ago. Can you tell us what was the reason behind that task force?
Absolutely. Number one, I'm very, very thankful to be here. I can yell loud enough, I won't need this microphone, believe me. If you can't hear me in the back, move closer because I'm actually a very good-looking guy, too. The ITF Cabotage Task Force was created out of ITF policy, actually. It's a deep embedded part of the ITF. Part is cabotage and the strength of national unions. In order to implement and to carry out the FOC campaign, that requires strong national unions, both seafarers and dockers. And to accomplish that, countries need strong cabotage laws. Canada was facing issues that we'll get into later. But what has been proven is you can have strong cabotage, you can have strong shipping companies, and you can maintain your competition levels and everything else within the world while still promoting and assisting your national seafarers. And the cabotage campaign that the ITF has established has reached out both to the traditional nations when it comes to ownership and labor supply. And during a conference that was held in South Africa, I think I can say everyone was pleasantly pleased with the participation of the labor supply countries who, when you mention cabotage, much along the lines of some governments and ship owners, my apologies, the word cabotage scares them. And it shouldn't, because cabotage is inclusive, it makes for good competition, and it makes for a strong national industry.
Thank you, Jim. Johnny, Norway is not one of the 91 countries that was mentioned in the report. What are your comments to the findings in the report?
Well, my comments will be that that proves that our arguments over the last decade is proven correct. It is possible to have cabotage regulations, and hopefully when the Parliament's decision has been fulfilled, Norway will be on the list of nations with regulations of the national trade.
Let's hope so. Stephen, a question to you. What have been the reactions to the ITF cabotage campaign?
Okay, so Jim mentioned in Cape Town we launched the initial findings, and we were pleasantly surprised, in fact, that sometimes we think Canada, North America, Australia, but we also know India, Indonesia, a lot of developing countries are also recognising the importance of cabotage. And they want to build their own maritime industry for their own maritime skills and a sustainable future for their sectors. And as so eloquently put, the reality is if you want to be a leading nation in maritime, you have to have the foundations. And that means you have to have the shore-based and then the sea-based skills. And for us, I think when we consider in our political bodies in the FPC steering group later this year, they're going to instruct us to put resources into implementing this program and supporting those that already have cabotage and promoting the arguments in the report, but also developing for the developing nations. I can tell you South Africa, we're working very closely with the government and employers to support the situation. In Kenya, which has got its own emerging oil and gas strategy, we're working with the government and employers. It isn't easy, it takes time. Nigeria, countries you wouldn't associate with the cabotage argument. So for us, it's been a really positive experience, and I think it will formulate some of the ongoing work that the ITF will put money and resources in to make sure we're successful.
Thanks. Deirdre, I have a question for you. It's been claimed that to have cabotage regulations would be contrary to the flag state principle. What are your comments to that?
Well, obviously the seas are regulated by the international conventions, and there's a balance to be struck between flag state, port states and coastal states. For me, it's quite clear that cabotage is an expression of coastal state jurisdiction. And it's also quite clear that the 91 countries who have cabotage in their national laws don't think that it's contrary to international law, because they also are subject to international law. So I think lawyers can enjoy debating this, but the reality speaks for itself when you see 91 countries around the world with regulations governing cabotage.
Just a follow-up question. You've been working with these issues for many, many years. Are you aware of any protest against coastal states that have introduced cabotage measures?
No, in fact, on the contrary, I would say that the countries who we surveyed who did not have cabotage, not one of them said to us that it had anything to do with a concern or a risk of sanctions. That was never mentioned to us. And I think it would be very surprising if there was a risk of sanction that 91 countries would have cabotage and risk that. So I don't think that's a credible concern.
Yeah. Hans Christian, I have a question for you. The policy of the Norwegian current government has been not to regulate the labor market at sea on the continental shelf, with the consequence that oil companies have subcontractors paying wages down to 35 kroner per hour. What do you think about this policy or lack of policy?
Well, this was the political line until just recently, where the parliament unanimously instructed the government to change the course, in line in line with the arguments that the Norwegian Seafarers Union, the Sea Officers Union, and the Norwegian LO has argumented for a very long time. And I think it's in due time that we have this work done, because I believe that it's perfectly okay for us to implement those kind of regulations. This has been our policy for many, many years, and it's very positive and uplifting to have the report from the ITF, which, in my point of view, just puts more argument under the line that we have been fulfilling for many years.
If you look at the land, if we had someone who was paid 35 kroner per hour, working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 9 months non-stop, what do you think the reaction would have been to that?
This is social dumping, and would be outcry in the newspapers and on news. But since this is taking place on the waters, just outside our doors, it's for some reason this hasn't, I think, reached the attention of the media and the public opinion. And I think it's very important that this work is now done, and we can put this kind of regulations in place, because what you describe is what we have been fighting against ever since 2004 and even before that. So even though social dumping, which I call it, takes place on the shelf and on the waters, doesn't make it any better than social dumping taking place on land.
Jim, I want to ask you a question. You are the president of the Canadian Seafarers International Union, and you and your union have struggled to maintain Canadian seafarers and Canadian employment conditions for a long time. Can you tell us a bit about the struggle that you've been through in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting to me to hear some of these arguments, because they're arguments we went through in Canada. About 2 years ago, Seafarers International Union, my union, took the step of suing the federal government in Canada for allowing temporary foreign workers to come in and work on board ships running cabotage within Canada. And there's two issues involved. Our legislation states that if there is no ship available in Canada, a company can apply for a waiver to bring in a vessel to run cabotage. But the separate issue is the crew. The crew have to go through the immigration process through our temporary foreign worker program. And that program clearly states that they can only be issued temporary foreign worker permits if there are no Canadian seafarers available and qualified to do the job. We were successful in our lawsuit. The Canadian government reached out to us to settle right before it went to court. And we've had 2 meetings now with Economic and Social Development Canada, where we have developed new policy with them that will be implemented when it comes to temporary foreign workers coming in as seafarers within Canada. And it's going to make it much more difficult. The legislation was always there that these workers were to be treated as if they were Canadian workers, which included Canadian wages, Canadian social conditions, the payment of taxes, all standards that Canadians were given when they came in as temporary foreign workers. This didn't take place. The workers were making as little as $2 per hour on board the ships. There was no follow-up, there were no taxes paid in most cases. When we brought this to the government, they were quite surprised. But they had no idea and no concept or experience in dealing with seafarers. This wouldn't happen on shore, as you just pointed out. If you brought in temporary foreign workers in Canada to crew a factory, you would have riots in the streets. But because it was happening on ships, nobody was aware. And it was a rubber stamp process, as far as the government was concerned. With the new regulations now that are going to be implemented very soon, each temporary foreign worker, if there are no Canadians available, will be issued a new employment contract with Canadian conditions. The ship owner will have to have a Canadian representative so that if anything happens with unpaid taxes, with injuries, with anything that goes on board, there is someone to go after. The Canadian Revenue Agency has said they will pursue owners worldwide for unpaid taxes when ships coming in on cabotage. There are many, many regulations, and the most important one of all is that that owner now bringing in that ship has to reach out to the unions to make sure there are no qualified Canadians available. So as a ship owner, if you're going to come to Canada now, you're going to be on a level playing field. The competition will be equal. Under CETA, the new trade agreement, which opened up one route in Canadian cabotage from Montreal to Halifax, Halifax to Montreal. Those ships may be able to come in under CETA, but the crew will still fall under the temporary foreign worker program in Canada, where Canadians first, no Canadians available, Canadian conditions for those workers. And that includes everything that Canadians have. And as a point of interest, we had a Swedish ship come into Canada recently with a Swedish crew and Filipino crew. They came in under temporary foreign worker permits. The Canadian unions organized that vessel under Canadian law. So they are now members of the Canadian unions. And not only that one ship, the Canadian government extended it fleet-wide. That if any of the fleet by that owner come to Canada, they're covered by our labor agreements. So the world has changed in Canada. The legislation is being enforced the way it should, and it's not hurting a soul.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the clock, but we have time for 1 or 2 questions. If it's anyone who wants to ask the panel any questions. Doesn't seem like that for the moment. And well, by that, I think we give a big applause to the participants. And I would have to ask Jim and Johnny to remain on stage, and because you have an announcement to make before we continue into the program.
Please use the microphone. Is the microphone? There we go. Please use the microphone. Now we got it. I just want to say something before I get into our announcement, and it's, you know, I know this is a week of political activities within Norway, and especially within this community. I guess it amazes me, Johnny, if I can just, you know, I won't be controversial, I promise. Well, maybe a little. I walk around the town and I see all the ships. I see all the people on board the ships. I see the politicians on board the ships giving their speeches. I see the news media there. I see a town full of people enjoying that strong maritime tradition and heritage. For God's sakes, protect it. The people, the young people on board this ship that are working for a future, the young kids I see walking around town that need a future. This week is more about who you are, if I can say that, and where you've come from, than it is about personal income tax. I got to speak closer. Anyway, it's more about things than just taxes, and it's about more than what's being presented. Embrace your tradition. It kills me. This is a maritime country, just like Canada. You can do so much. So much. I have to use the mic or I won't be on record. Do something, for God's sake, politicians. We have a very important announcement to make along the lines of what I just talked about when it comes to the legislation in Canada and the use of temporary workers within our coasting trade. I'm happy to say that the Norwegian Seamen's Union and the SIU of Canada will today sign a cooperation agreement, memorandum of understanding, on Norwegian seafarers in the Canadian offshore. It's entered into between us today to strengthen Canadian cabotage and Norwegian cabotage, and to hopefully stabilize the exploitation of foreign seafarers within Canada on ships that come in. And the ship owners that are here, this is an opportunity for you. Those of you who have the Norwegian flag, employ Norwegian seafarers, and operate under Norwegian collective agreements. We are going to promote the use of Norwegian seafarers within the Canadian offshore on Norwegian vessels. We don't want FOC vessels on our offshore. We don't want crews exploited, and we will support the use of Norwegian seamen and the use of Norwegian companies. We have a lack of qualified seafarers in Canada right now. You can help fill that gap, and we will support that 100%. If there are no qualified Canadians available, caveat, then we want Norwegian seafarers used on Norwegian flag vessels. There are lots of opportunities in Canada's offshore. Our reserves are big. They're still going after them. They're still doing it. We have places in the Arctic where we need experienced seafarers used to working in those conditions. And I had a company tell me not long ago that their Filipino crew was better at working in the Arctic than Canadians and Norwegians. I had to argue that point. We're used to those conditions. Filipinos are great seafarers, but when it comes to working in those conditions, I don't think there's anything better than us. And we stand by that. But we're going to work together. We've spoken to our government, and we're confident that we can have the government adopt this plan. And we're going to work very closely with you, Johnny, to get that done. This is an opportunity. This is what the Cabotage Task Force is all about. It's about assisting each other when it comes to our cabotage and assisting each other in times when we need each other. We see this as an opportunity for Norwegian seafarers to be employed. We know that Canada doesn't have the vessels that are needed in our offshore, and that there will be calls to bring vessels in. Set yourself up to be those vessels, to be those owners, to be those good Norwegian employers who help their people, help their crews to get work. We will look after your crews while they're there. I'll send one of my great representatives down every month to make sure everything is being enforced the way it should when it comes to Canadian legislation and the contracts. But they will be your contracts, your flags, your crews, and working together. And we'll reach out. You reach out to us, you reach out to Johnny, we will reach out to whoever is putting the bids out to make sure you get the work. And together we can stop the exploitation of foreign workers in the Canadian market. and we can gain employment and work for the companies and the seafarers. And that's what we're signing today, and we'll follow through with it.
Just a follow-up. We know, and I see that we have ship owners' representatives in the room. I hope you take this opportunity to tell your members that there is an opportunity to get a waiver in Canadian offshore. And I can assure you that me and Jim here will look what is happening. We're going to revise and follow up. So